We'll start today on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. Yud Ches Amud Beis. And we're in the bottom third of the Amud. That's what we got up to yesterday. And if you have Yud Ches Amud Beis, we're looking for a Gemara that starts with the word Itmar. Counting up from the bottom of the Amud, I would assume it's approximately 15 lines up before the end of Yud Ches Amud Beis. And you'll see the first word in the line is L'seder. L'seder Peronios. You see that? So again, you're counting up 15 lines be'erech. I didn't count it from the bottom of Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. And hopefully, if you have the same Tzuras Hadaf that I have, you'll see a word L'seder. You have it? Itmar. Rav v'Rabbi Chanina Amri Botla Megillas Tainus. We have an entity called Megillas Tainus, which enumerates those days which were happy days in Israel, different things that happened and occurred on those special days. And as a result, they are enumerated in Megillas Tainus as days in which you are not allowed to have hesped or tainios. These are, shall we say, minor holidays. And the Gemara now is going to address the following issue. Are those holidays still binding today? Rebbe Rav v'Rabbi Chanina Amri Batla Megillas Tainus. With the loss, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, those days are no longer commemorated as happy days. That's called Batla Megillas Tainus. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua, and Levi, on the other hand, Amri, they hold low Batla Megillas Tainus, and therefore, to the same extent that during the time that the Beis Hamikdash stood on those days that are enumerated in Megillas Tainus, we were enjoined from Hesped V'Tainus. That prohibition of Hesped V'Tainus is still binding even today, even post-Churban. Rav Rabbi Chanina Amri Batla Megillas Tainus. And we said that there was a pasuk in Zechariah in the 8th chapter that said that Tzom Haravi, etc., those specific fast days, Yilu Lebeis Yisrael Yehuda L'Sasan L'Simcha Hachikam. This is what the pasuk has in mind. Bisman Sheyei Shalom, when the nations of the world are not subjugating the Jewish people, and the Beis Hamikdash is standing, is Yilu L'Sasan L'Simcha. Then those days are Asur Behesped V'Tainus. But nevertheless, Ein Shalom, if the nations of the world have subjugated us and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, then those very days that are enumerated in the 8th chapter of Zechariah are days of Tzom, of fast days. V'hanach nami ki hani. And just like you say that those days are fast days, so too the special holidays that are incorporated and enumerated in Megillas Tainus become, I wouldn't say sad days, but certainly no longer happy days, and therefore Batla Megillas Tainus. So the Megillas Tainus and all its days in which we are prohibited in Hesped V'Tainus, because these days are endowed with a certain level of a moed, all that is bata with Churban Abayis. But Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua, and Levi, they disagree. Lo bata Megillas Tainus, and you cannot make a comparison to the change in Churban, which took place in Churban Abayis regarding those days that were l'sason l'simcha during the time that the Mikdash stood, and with the destruction of the Mikdash, they became days that are fast days. That doesn't tell you anything about the happy days. In other words, those days were established as happy days because the Mikdash stood. I'm talking about the days that are specified in Zechariah that we discussed yesterday. Other days will continue to be holidays even after Churban Abayis, because those days that are designated by Zechariah, that has to do with the Mikdash. Either the Mikdash stands and those are happy days, l'sasan or l'simcha, Zechariah says, or On the contrary, if it's Ein Shalom and the Mikdash is destroyed, those are days of tzom. But Megillas Tainus itself, which enumerates other days during the calendar year, where we are obligated to note those days as days of happiness and celebration, that still is binding today. Hani Huditolina Rachmana, the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, those days that are listed by Zechariah as either days that are fast days or days of Sasan and Simcha, that all depends upon the Beis HaMikdash. Those days become sad days and days of fasting and Avelus because of the destruction of the Mikdash. And on each one of those 4 days, a different thing happened, whether it was the siege on Jerusalem, whether it was breaking down the walls of Jerusalem, whether it was the death of Gedalia ben Achikam, whether it was the destruction of the Mikdash when they set it on fire. But those other days that are happy days, and we'll see one example in a minute, because of some great event that took place on those days were enumerated in the list of Megillas Tainus, and that's still binding even today. Masiv Rav Kahana, and now we're going to get a slew of objections, of questions that are hurled in the in the direction of Rav and Rabbi Hanina, who maintain that Batla Megillas Tainus. Maisa v'gazru Tainus b'Chanukah belud. Now Chanukah, the 8 days of Chanukah are listed, enumerated in the list of Megillas Tainus as days that are prohibited from Tainus and Hesped. And Yorad Rabbi Eliezer v'Rochas, they were Gozer a Tainus on Chanukah, and that took place in the city of Lud. And Rabbi Eliezer washed himself on that very day when they decreed a fast day. Now, again, you have to know that a fast day in this context means not just abstaining from eating and drinking, but from all the inuyim, the afflictions, including rechitza. So, in a sense, Rabbi Eliezer was making a rebellious statement here that I'm not going to accept your gzeira. Why? Because it's Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a day which is also b'tainus. On the contrary, we should go to the mikveh or go to the Beis HaMechutz and go to the Turkish baths. Rabbi Yoshua went ahead, the Siper, and he tells this story over to the Chacham, V'Amulahem. The members of that particular community said, Tzu'u v's'anu al mashes anisa. The very fact that you went and took a bath and enjoyed the benefit of hot water on as a bath on Hanukkah, when we instituted and decreed a gzeira on that Hanukkah, that it's a tainus, you have to fast another fast day to make up for the fact that you violated this fast day. In any event, we see clearly from this brisa that even at the time of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, they were way after the Churban Abayis, and nevertheless, there was still an Isser of Hesped v'Tainus during Yemei Chanukah by virtue of Megillas Tainus. You see that Megillas Tainus is still binding even after the Churban, and that's against the sheet of Rav and Rabbi Hanina. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef responds, Shiny Chanukah, even if I hold Batla Megillas Tainus, but Chanukah has a special status, and it will not be Batla. Why? So the Gemara offers one interpretation, rejects it, and then offers a slightly different interpretation. The first interpretation is the Ikar mitzvah. Since we have a mitzvah of lighting their Chanukah, therefore Chanukah goes beyond just the regular celebration in which we abstain from Hesped v'Tainus. It's a positive mitzvah that's connected with Chanukah, and that's going to continue to exist even according to Rav and Rabbi Hanina after the Churban Abayis. Amalei Abaye. V'tibatel ihi v'tibatel mitzvasa. When we say that Batla Megillas Tainus, we mean that those days are no longer significant days. And once you take away the Yom HaMiyuchad status, the special status of the day, there's no mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. Elam Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef backtracks a little bit and reformulates his answer. Shiny Chanukah d'mefarsim nisa. The mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is an opportunity to publicize God's miracle. That gives it a special status. And we want to be Mekayim that mitzvah. And if we rob Chanukah of its status as a Yom Miyuchad, as a special day with an Isa Hesped Tainus, then we're going to forfeit that opportunity, the great possibility of being mefarsing the nes. So we're going to give it a chashivas, a certain significant status, as if it was a moed, as if it was a holiday which the Torah required, and therefore we don't want to be mevat. Now they come with another kasha, Motziv Rav Acha Bar Huna. And now they're going to ask another kasha on Rav and Rabbi Chanina. B'tlasa b'tishrei, on the third day of Tishrei. A great thing occurred on the third day of Tishrei. And that's recorded and listed amongst the great days of holidays in Megillas Tainus. What took place on the third day of Tishrei that made it into a joyous holiday? Betela ad karta min shtaraya. When Yochanan, Kohen Gadol, took over the Malchus after the great miracle of Hanukkah, he declared that every single document should mention the name of God. What do I mean? Even a secular document, like let's say a loan, a deed of a loan. And that was instituted by Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Why? Because Shegazer Malchus Yavan, when they were subjugated by the Greeks, and the Greeks hated our religion, and that's the beginning of Shmad, right? So Gazra, they made it that a Jew was not allowed to mention the name of God. When the Hashmonaim defeated the Greeks, Iskinu, now again, the word Iskinu means they made a takana, but in this case, the takana was instituted by the Malchus, by the kingship of Beis Hashmonai. And what was that takana? Even on a secular document, they should mention the name of God. And that they would write that this is the X year of the reign of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Kel Elyon. They would add the word Kel, which is the name of God. This is the minyan shnots. Yochanan, as a tafkid, his job was Kohen Gadol, Kel Elyon, who's a Kohen Gadol to the holy God. And the reason why this institution was made is because they wanted to get the Jews back to the pre-Yavan level when they used to mention the name of God. However, even though the Malchus made that institution, the Chachamim, the scholars, the sages of Israel were not at all excited about it. They said, you know what's going to happen as a result of writing the name of God on a Takmil of Machar after the halva is paid up, and the malva now gives the shtar over to the lover is going to throw the shtar into the waste paper basket. And Zeporeas chovo, he pays up his chov, and he chucks it into the ashpa, and it's a shtar mutal, the ashpa, and the name of God is now being thrown into the garbage pail. Is bitlum, therefore the chachamim were mavatel this original takana of Yochanan and the Malchus of Hashmonai, and a miracle happened that they were mavatel on that particular day, which was the 3rd of Tishrei, that takana, v'yosa yom asu yontiv, because since they were successful in being mavatel the takana of the Malchus of Yochanan, Kohen Gadol, Hashmonai, Kohen Gadol, therefore it was a day of simcha, and it was included in Megillas Tainus. Now we get back to the kasha on Rav and Rav Chanina. If you're going to tell me that Batla Megillas Tainus, then I don't understand. The Gemara objects. Kamaisa Batal Achranaisa Mosifin? With the Churban Abayis, according to your Shita, Rav and Rav Chanina, we enter into a period of sadness in the history of Klal Yisrael. The bias is no longer standing. And now you're telling me that days that were happy days that are mentioned in Zechariah now become days of tzom, of fasting, of grief and mourning of Avelus. And now you're telling me that after the Churban Abayis, We're going to establish the 3rd of Tishrei as a holiday. We're making new holidays and celebrations after the Churban Habayis. On the contrary, after the Churban Habayis, we're taking days of celebration and converting them into days of mourning. And all those days of celebration that were recorded in Megillas Taanis are all batel according to Yoshim. So how could it be that now, in a period of time after Churban Habayis, they're going to establish a holiday? The Gemara answers, what is the subject of this brisa? And on what Gimel Tishrei did this happen? When the Mikdash was still standing. Keep in mind that from the time of the Nesa Chanukah till the destruction of the Mikdash was 2 centuries. And during that period of time, we're not in Butler Megillas Taanis, because Butler Megillas Taanis is only after the Churban. So the Megillas Taanis is very much alive and active and binding, and therefore they would institute new days as holidays. As long as the Beis HaMikdash was standing, we're in a period of happiness and joy, we add days of joy and happiness. And now we start the daf for today, and that is daf Yutes. You notice that I'm overly pressured. I'm always pressured with daf Yomi, but today even more so. It's because we're already 15 minutes into the shir. We haven't started the daf for today. All right, let's go on. The Gemara says, what are you telling me? That on the 3rd of Tishrei, they had to establish this day as a holiday? If you're telling me the Mikdash stood, then this is one of the days which is called Tzom HaShvi, etc. Shvi means the 7th month from Nisan, which is the month of Tishrei. And on that day, we have, during the course of the Mikdash standing, a holiday called Tzom Gedalia, Gimel Tishrei. Again, it's very hard for us to relate because we're 2,000 years after the Churban. But during the Mikdash time, these days, Zechariah tells me, were days of Simcha and Sasan. And therefore, how can you tell me that they established Gimel Tishrei as a holiday because they were Mavatil, the Takana of Yochanan going Gadol, etc., and they no longer with the names of God be written on shtaros? Well, it's a day that already has the status of a holiday because it's l'sasan l'simcha. It's the day that Gedalia was killed. Omar Rav lo nitzracha elo lesar es shalafanov. This is what you call in Brisk tzvei dinim, if you're familiar with that. Classic example of tzvei dinim. There are 2 dinim in a holiday. There's one din of a holiday that is simply inherent in the day itself. The calendar day is important because Zechariah says that these days are holidays, l'sasan, l'simcha, as long as the Mikdash stands. Then the din of Simcha, that status is limited to the 24-hour period of that day. Itzumo shel yom. Then we have another halach, and that's called Megillas Taanis. Those days are not mentioned by Zechariah and Novi. They are holidays. And since they're not written anywhere in Tanakh, they're only recorded in Megillas Taanis, they need what's called chizuk. Are you familiar with that term, chizuk? Because again, it's going to come up over and over again. Chizuk means to strengthen it. And what they did was, when in Megillas Taanis they designated a day because of some event that took place as a holiday, what they did is they began that holiday 1 day earlier. That's called lefana. So that would mean on the 2nd day of Tishrei, a day before the day in which they destroyed the enactment of writing the name of God in the shtaros, on that day itself they were enjoined from Hesped V'Tainis. In other words, they established in Megillas Taanis that the Yom Simcha, so to speak, the celebration would expand and overflow to include even the day before. Whereas if we're operating within the confines of Zechariah and Navi, which means Yom Shemespo Gedalia Ben Achikam, that day and only that day is Asur Behesped V'Tainis. So Megillas Taanis, by adding Gimel Tishrei because of that event, is now expanding the Isur Taanis to include even the 2nd day of Tishrei. And here we have a long, long discussion in the commentaries. Wouldn't the second day of Tishrei be considered Rosh Hashana? Wouldn't it be considered the day after Rosh Chodesh? There would many, many different arguments here in the commentaries. If we had another 5 hours, we would do this to figure out why Beis, the second day of Tishrei, wouldn't be in a status of a holiday if not for Megillas times. In any event, the Gemara asks, Shalachon of Nami, even if you're talking about the second day of Tishrei, typically, I will establish an Iser Hesped V'Tainis. Why? The Havila Yom Shali Achar Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is a Moed. The Torah says, Yom Simchaschem Moedechem Roshei Chodshechem. And with regard to a Moed, the halacha is that there's an Iser Tainis on the day after a Moed. It's sort of like what we call, again, don't quote me on this, it's called Isru Chag, so to speak, the day after. So there's an Iser Tainis as a result of Rosh Chodesh and the day after Rosh Chodesh. So that the second day of Tishrei, insofar as it's the day after Rosh Chodesh, is enjoined from Hesped V'Tainis. Why do you need Megillas Tainis to expand the Yom Gimel to Beis Tishrei, Lefanov, when in any event that's the day after Rosh Chodesh, which is also a Moed? And the Gemara answers, as far as being the day after Rosh Chodesh, that would not generate an Iser Tainis. Why? Because what kind of a Moed needs Chizuk, and therefore even the day afterwards is also a Hesped Tainis? That's only a Moed Dirabanan, a rabbinic Moed, which is not at all incorporated into the Bible. That needs Chizuk. But Rosh Chodesh is incorporated into the Bible, V'yom Simchaschem Roshei Chodshechem, and therefore it doesn't need Chizuk. And the day after Rosh Chodesh is Mutar B'Hesped V'Tainis. Rosh Chodesh Doraisa Lo Boy Chizuk. Anything that's a holiday, a Moed, and it's written in the Torah doesn't need Chizuk. Desanya I'll quote a Brisa. And this is part of Megillas Tainis. Hayomim Elaksuvim Megillas Tainis Asurim Bein Lifneim Bein Lachreim. However, Shabbosos v'Yomim Tovim Haim and only Haim Asurim B'Hesped V'Tainis, but Lifneim Lachreim Mutarim. Uma Hefresh Ben Zelazeh. Why is it that in the case of a day which is incorporated in Megillas Tainis, we're going to prohibit Tainis even before the day after, but not in the case of Moadim that are written in the Torah, Shabbosos v'Yomim Tovim? And the answer is, Ma Hefresh Ben Zelazeh Halalu Divrei Torah. The aim Divrei Torah tzrichim chizuk. We don't have to expand the day of the holiday if it's a holiday doraisa, but halalu, those moadim that are enumerated in Megillas Tainis, which are not in the Torah, is Divrei Sofrim. They're all mirabanan. So Divrei Sofrim tzrichim chizuk, and therefore, had they not been kovea gimel tishrei as a yontiv, as far as being the day after Rosh Chodesh, it would be mutar b'Hesped V'Tainis, because it's written, Rosh Chodesh is written in the Torah and it doesn't need chizuk. Now that we added and upgraded the status of Gimel Tishrei to a holiday d'Rabbanan of Megillas Tainis, now it's also on the previous day and on the day after, as far as Hesped V'Tainis. Now, and once again, I just want to mention that the Mefarshim go to town over here because the second day of Tishrei also has a different name to it. Anybody know what I mean? It's Rosh Hashana, at least in Chutz La'aretz. But here we're dealing with Bezdin. In the Vad of Bezdin, there was no suffix about which day was Rosh Chodesh, and therefore they knew which was Aleph Tishrei, and there was no celebration of Rosh Hashanah on the second day of Tishrei. The Gemara asks me typically the Havila Yom Shel Lifnei Yom Generik Bo Gedalia Ben Achikam. Amar Rav Ashi Gedalia Ben Achikim Divrei Kabbalah v'Divrei Kabbalah K'Divrei Torah Tamu, meaning Ein Tzarech Chizuk. So the fact that Zechariah specifies this day of the third day of the seventh month as the day that Gedalia Ben Achik was killed, which is L'Sasan L'Simcha, as long as the Mikdash stood, that doesn't need any chizuk because it's already incorporated into the Bible. And admittedly, not into the 5 books of Moses, but nevertheless, it's in Divrei Kabbalah, which includes all the 24 holy books of the Tanakh. And Divrei Kabbalah, Kidivrei Torah Dami, V'enam Tzrichim Chizuk, and therefore, if not for the fact that Megillus Tainus designated the 3rd of Tishrei as one of those celebrated days, if not for that, the day of Beis Tishrei, the day beforehand, would not be a day of Easter Hesperitais. Masiv Rav Tuvi Bar Masna, another kasha against Rav and Rabbi Chanina, who hold that Botla Megillus Tainus. It says in Megillus Tainus, Be Esrim Utmanya Bey, on the 28th day of the month of Adar. That was also a great day in Jewish history, and they declared it as a day that's also Hesperitais, Asa B'Tzorosa Tov Tzol Yudot. A great piece of news came in the direction of Israel, right? Israel World News. You know what I'm talking about? What did they find out about? The lo Ya'idun Meo Raisa. Ya'idun means to be porridge. What happened was that during the Malchus Romi, they made a Gzera decree that the Jews were not allowed to study Torah. They were not allowed to circumcise their sons. And they would have to violate the Torah publicly at the pain of death. And now a chap, a very important Tana by the name of Yehuda ben Shamua, we very rarely hear his name. And we'll soon see who are his Rebbeim and when did he live. But anyway, he came along during this Roman decree. And Me'asa, Yehuda ben Shamua Chaver, Holchu v'notlu eitza mi matronisa. Matronisa is a non-Jewish woman that's held in great esteem in governmental circles, so that government officials come to see her all the time. She's very, very well respected. So Yehuda decided he's going to take an eitzah from her. Maybe she could give him a good eitzah how to avoid or to avoid this decree. I have an idea for you. And we see this, by the way, in America today. You know, rioting and so forth and so on. It goes back to my youth as well. There was rioting then, during Vietnam and so forth. Today there's rioting, Black Lives Matter and so forth and so on. And this is what she gives an eitzah to the Jewish people. She tells them, Amr and Bov Hafginu. Today we call it a Hafgana, right? And what you should do, Balayla, do it during the night. The nighttime, you're going to, make a lot of noise out in the streets, and it's going to. Now, once they did this Hafgana Balayla, the noises and the clamor hit the ears of the Sarei Rome. The Amru and the Mafkinim, when you go out and you protest, you demonstrate, you have to have, a chant. What was that chant? Ei Shamayim, God in heaven. Lo achichem anachnu. Aren't we your brother? Lo b'nei av echad. Don't we have the same father? Yitzchak Avinu? Because Esav is the son of Yitzchak and Rome is the descendants of Esav. So we are brothers. Below b'nei me'achas anachnu, we share the same mother, Rivka. Manish tanenu mikol uma v'loshen. And even if you're not going to be sympathetic to our cause because we are brothers, but we're no worse than any other nation on the face of the earth. So why are we different? And a miracle happened, and the Romans decide to repeal the Gzera, and from that day and on, the Jews were permitted to study Torah. The Otzo Hayom on that day was the 28th of Adar, Asom Liyantiv. Now we're ready for Rab Tuvi's kasha. Isal kedaita botla Megillus Tainus, and there's no longer Megillus Tainus. Is kamaisa botul achranaisa mosifin? With the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, you want to be mavatal all those happy days. And now, an event that takes place during the life of Yehuda bar Shamua, that's already after the Churban Abayis, as we'll soon prove. And yet he established that day as a day of holiday, of celebrations, with an Easter Hesperitais incorporated into Megillus Tainus. And if you'll tell me that Yehuda lived at a time when the Mikdash stood, But Yehuda ben Shavua, Talmido of Rabbi Meir, he was a student of Rabbi Meir, as we were about to prove from Tuva V'Tara. Rabbi Meir, Basar Hachiham. Rabbi Meir was after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. How do we know that Rabbi Meir was after the Churban Beis Hamikdash? The last Tana at the time of Churban was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That's a Gemara in Gittin. Rabbi Eliezer was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Eliezer was amongst those pallbearers at the time of the death of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Akiva was a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer. That's the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Rabbi Meir, the Gemara in Eruvin tells us, was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. So this is 3 generations, basically, of Talmidim and Rebbeim after the Churban Abayis at the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Yehuda ben Shammai is ben Shavua is a Talmud of Rabbi Meir. So we're way after the Churban Abayis, and yet they were Kovei Moed on the 28th of Adar to celebrate the undermining this terrible decree of the Romans. And now the Gemara is going to prove that Yehuda ben Shavua was actually a Talmud of Rabbi Meir. And for this, we need a little bit of an introduction. The halacha is that if you have a metal kli and it breaks, even if it had contracted tumah, the tumah is parcha b'avid. The tumah just completely leaves it. But the Chacham made a gzera that if you'll fix up this metal kli, then it goes back to its original status. And even if it doesn't come in contact with the sheretz, it retroactively, so to speak, becomes tameh. But the exception to that rule is a glass kli that became tameh, and then it broke, and now he fixes it together. Then it doesn't go back to its original state of tumah. But what happens if they add some sort of a piece to the clay's chuchis that makes it functional again? So the Chacham were not machmir to declare that it's got its original tumah. Now, the brisa that we're about to study is going to address a case of a kli chuchis that was tameh and then broke, and they fixed it with oferis. Oferis is a kind of lead, a kind of metallic substance. It's not place chuchis shenikvu. V'hitif l'tochan avor or aver. So they poured this molten lead into the cracks of this glass, and they were able to put it all together again. Omar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Yehuda ben Shamua metami mitrum Rabbi Meir. Yehuda ben Shamua quotes his Rebbe Rabbi Meir that even though this kli's chuchis did not come in contact with the sheretz a second time around after they fixed the nekev, they were sosing the nekev, nevertheless, it goes back to its original status of tameh. And on the top of Yutes Amid Beis, the Chacham disagree, and they hold that a kli's chuchis will never return to its original status of tumah. And the oferes, even though it's a maimid, even though it keeps the kli together, this lead that he added, nevertheless, it's tafel, it's considered insignificant. Anyway, we see clearly from this price that Yehuda ben Shamua was a Talmud of whom? Of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir was after the Churban Abayis. So therefore, this takana that was made by Yehuda ben Shamua after he successfully repealed the Gzera of the Romans, and he declared that the 28th of Adar, when that Gzera Ra was repealed, is a day of Simcha, that's after the Churban Abayis. And you're telling me Megillas Tainus is Batel, and after the Churban, they canceled all the days of celebration, and now they added another day of celebration. The Churban Abayis period is a period of Avelus. We don't add days of celebration. I'm just looking at my clock here. Do I have a few minutes just to add the Marsha here? Because I was fascinated by this Marsha, but I left it out because I figure we don't have any time. But I'm looking at my clock, and I think maybe we do have time. So we'll see. The Marsha on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph, if you could turn back for a moment.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I meant to say Yud Tes Amud Aleph. What did I say? Well, now we're on Yud Tes Amud Beis. I'm just saying, if you go back to Yud Tes Amud Aleph for a moment, you'll see that the protesters in the middle of the night, said three things. Number one, they said, we are brothers. Number two, they said, we share the same father, meaning Yitzchak. And number three, we share the same mother, meaning Rivka. So the Maharsha wants to know, why did they have to say these three things? And he claims that these three are allusions to three different tainas that the Jews had against the Romans, meaning three different reasons and claims why the Roman government, the anti-Semitic persecuting Roman government, should repeal these gzeros. When they said that we are brothers, that's a remez to that gzera. Now, keep in mind, there are three gzeros. Let's go over the three gzeros of the Romans. Number one, lo yaska b'Torah. Number two, lo yomu es b'neihem. And number three, yichalu et shamosos. Keneged each one, if you match it up, says the Maharsha, you have a claim, a counterclaim. First of all, we're brothers. With regard to Bnei Esav, the Torah says, lo tisayev adomi ki achicha. So the Malchus of Romi is considered the Malchus of Esav. And it says, ki achicha, that Esav is your brother. So if Esav is your brother, how could one brother undermine the study of the Torah of another brother? Number two, lo b'nei av echad, we both share the same father, Yitzchak, and Yitzchak had his milah on the eighth day. Lo b'nei eim achas anachnu, we have a mother named Rivka. Rivka, according to the Medrash, was very meticulous about Shmira Shabbos. And the Gemara darshans the pasuk by Yevi Eha Yitzchak Ohela Sara Imo Shahayad Ner Dolik Ohela Shal Rivka Milel Shabbos Leil Shabbos. And this was a reference to the Gzeira against Shabbos. Okay, we're now continuing here on Daf Yutes Amid Beis Tanoi. The Gemara says the question of whether Batla Megillas Tainus or Lo Batla Megillas Tainus is in fact a Machlokas Tanoim, and each one of these two schools of Amoraim are standing on the shoulders of different Tanoim. Desanya, we learned to the Brisa